Hello. So first, thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Canada Plays, Asmodee, and Gaming Lab. It's gonna be a challenge. First, I'm French, so sorry about my English. The second problem is that I'm a sociologist, so I'm spending my time just looking for data, and I'm gonna try to make that interesting. And it's the end of the day, so I know I'm the last talk, so I'm gonna try to entertain you a little bit. Um, so I'm working in a lab and in Paris, which is for 40 years now, working about game practices and video games, board games, toys, digital games. And for a long time, I had a question. A question what was posed most of the time by journalists when it was about Christmas, and they were seeing people buying toys or board games, and so they were asking to the supposed experts. One simple question is that are we playing more than before? And I I thought that it looks like a simple question, but nobody has really the answer. And I started with colleagues to work about the evolution of game practices in France from mainly the 60s to today and trying to see what's going on. So, about digital games, we have a lot of study. About board games, it's really more difficult to know what's going on now. So, the central question is this one: are we playing more than before? So I started to make research about statistical survey, and the answer is really hard to tell. So that's it. Thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup. No, why that's so difficult to answer that simple question? First of all, the world of games is really hard to measure for many reasons. First one is that most of the time, what's considered as a game or a play, it varies over time. The thing that when I'm making statistical survey to the French population and I'm asking, are you a gamer or do you play video games? Oh, I hate that. I'm not that. Do you play board games? Oh no, it's a waste of time. I hate that. But when you're asking, what did you do this morning? Oh, I played a little bit of Scrabble on my iPhone, for example. Or yeah, so it's really hard to measure because people doesn't have any clear idea sometimes of what does that mean playing, or they have a representation of what is play and what is not play. So it's really hard to measure. For example, when you're looking for the most played video game in France, and that's also a difficulty because some board games or video games are really famous, and you have the feeling that everybody is playing that game. But for example, when you're looking for what's the most played video games in France, what would you say? It's not Fortnite. It's not Minecraft. What? No, it's this one. And really, when you're so the difficulty is sometimes when, and that's my case, I like playing and I have a lot of friends playing board games, but my network gives me a sense of a reality of game. But when you're making statistical survey to the general population, sometimes you have big surprise. So yeah, the most played video game in France is not Fortnite, not FIFA, not Call of Duty, but the Free Cell, this simple solitaire card game, and play mostly alone on a computer. So for the most played board games, it's more easier. I think you know that. It's still the Monopoly. So I'm making survey with colleague asking, okay, what kind of board game, what title did you play? And Monopoly is still so, but I wanted to have something more in the long term. I wanted to understand how the audience, how the play practices evolve through times. So I've made a kind of investigation into investigation. So that means I've looked for a lot of statistical survey, just in France, and trying to make a kind of history of play practices or game practices in France. So I've read a lot of statistical survey, mainly public survey, but there was one was really, really interesting. This one. I think you have that too in Canada. I'm not sure, but I think that most of the country uh, do that. It's called the time use survey. So that's a survey that instead of the problem we have when we're making survey is that you're imposing questions and titles, and I'm going to ask you, do you play Fortnite? Do you play? But if I don't think about free cell, nobody would know that free cell is the most played digital game. So time use survey is a kind of survey which is really different, where you're asking people to write what they're doing in a day. So, and hour by hour. So this one, sorry, it's in French. So sommeil, I'm sleeping. I wake up, I go to the toilet, I dress myself, I'm looking for bread. So that we are in France. I'm buying my bread. I go back home. And based on this, and this kind of statistical survey started in the beginning of the 60s. So we had a good indication of the place of board games or video games in everyday life. So I use a lot of, to understand the evolution of the board games, I used a lot of this statistical survey, and I used a lot too a big collection we have at my university. It's called Le Fonds Patrimonial du Jeu de Société, the board game archive. I don't know, yeah. Thank you, ChatGPT, for the translation. So, which is a big collection of 20,000 board games, and from the 19th century to till today. And the I think the oldest one we have is 1845. It's really the beginning of the industry in Europe and in North America. And so I also checked a kind of the way that board game address to people. So when you're looking at an object, it can give you a clue of who's the audience, for example. So I work with colleagues about the evolution of board games through this gigantic collection, and so that's the second big data I'm going to use today for this presentation. So we have so many board games. I think this one you should like this one especially. So when you look closely at the evolution of board games in France, and I think we should do the same job in other countries, is that what emerged is four movements. From the 60s, it's what we call a tidy world of gaming structured by social class, really. And it's a really comfortable world for the sociologist. I will tell you why, but everything is really well positioned. Social class play this kind of game, and relating to gender position in the society, you have these kind of habits of playing. And the 80s is really a turning point. With the emergence, we'll see that with a kind of fun morality. So that means suddenly board games started to be fun. And before the 80s, of course, there was some fun board games, but it wasn't the most predominant kind of games. So 80s is really the moment where board games start to lose their moral education. Before the 80s, most of the games we have in the collection is about education, citizenship, maybe moral education, game for Christian, and suddenly in the 80s you see that a lot of board games and the majority of board games start to be trying to be fun. So the 90s, I'll go back there. It's the moment where there's a kind of acceleration of play practices in France, and we'll finish with the recent data we have. So when I was talking about the 60s, like a tidy world of gaming, when you look at the time survey, in this period, you were playing mainly 6 minutes per day. So that's an average. Just to give you an idea now. So it's playing everything, board games. At this time, there was no digital games, but also outdoor games, stuff like that. So it's 6 minutes per day. Now it's definitely close to 30 minutes per day. And the average French adult devoted less than 6 minutes. And by comparison, television was much more important. And when you look closely at what's the dominant kind of play, it's mainly card game in France. And when you look more closely, you see that the dominant setup of game was playing cards with colleague in a cafe, in a pub, and that was really, really dominant. And what's really characteristic too is that it's really board games and card games are really played by popular classes. And when you look at the board games as we know now, it was quite different. So many workers, many craftsmen were playing in their everyday life at the pub or in their workplace, and goes on. So playing with kids at home or with friends at home was really a minority. Was really, there was few people playing that. So it was more this kind of domestic play were more related to, we say in French, la petite bourgeoisie, so the bourgeoisie. So people from the middle of upper class, but they were playing much less than the working class. So it was about 25% of the population saying that they use the board games they have at their place with friends, with kids, with people. Yeah. So in the 80s, we can see that the sociology, which is before really anchored into popular class, is changing a lot. And when you look at the 80s, you see that in the leisure time we have, which is increasing, almost all of the play practices are increasing. For example, so that I don't have a laser. So when you look at electronic games, video games, they start in France to come at the beginning of the 70s, and fastly it's going to grow. And even crossword, when you look the practice of crossword, it's going to increase too. The only thing is that the betting games, it's called what we call PMU betting games, are starting to. I will explain that later. Are starting to decrease, but all of the kind of games that the statistical survey measure, you can see that it's increasing. And we can see that playing cards at home starting to become in the 80s something that is more frequent than before. Yeah. So what we could see is that people are playing more, and at this time we start in the beginning of the 80s to see the impact of electronic games. But at this time, the notion of electronic games was really, really bizarre. I mean, you have like this kind of game, just like Simon. So it's still a world between board games and electronic games. So the first study we have about video games in France are not really clear about what kind of game they are measuring. But anyway, so we can see that electronic games in the 80s start to grow. So in 81, 5% of the population had some electronic game at home, and only 3% said that they were playing to this game. When you look at the crossword, as I was saying, it's really increasing too at the beginning of the 80s. So Sudoku is also included into this stat. But so that's crossword and puzzle game. I don't know what it's English for. But when you look closely, of course, it's related to age people. But each new generation is playing more than the generation before. When you look more in detail about board games, so board games is also increasing. When you compare the population playing board games in 67 compared to 87, you can clearly see that in almost every period of age, it's increasing. So the young people are playing more, the young adults are playing more, and age people too are playing more. So suddenly you can see that something is shifting in the 80s, and from the 80s it didn't stop. So what's also interesting in this shift is that when I was saying before, the 60s and 90s is really related to working class in France, and they are mainly playing to board games, dice games, card games. And with the 80s, you can see that there's a shift in terms of sociology, and popular classes are playing less and less, and the main audience is starting to be middle class and upper middle class. That's executive and intellectual profession. That's where you can see that board game starts to be a regular practice. And of course, this shift of audience, this transformation of players in France, is related to a new kind, what we say, a new board games regime. So that the apparition of Dungeons and Dragons, of new kind of board games like Zargos, who had a big success in France in the 80s. I don't know if you know this one. And of course, yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, the killer, the living action role playing game too. And so, step by step, we see that for this generation, grown into the 80s, playing board games with friends, with sometimes parents, but not a lot, starting to be a regular leisure and regular activity. So the product itself are changing at the same time. So, for example, when you look at the 80s, so with colleague, we work on the collection, and we had one question is that when the game designers start to be credited on board games. So for a long time there was, and still now there's a difference between Europe and North America, where in Europe the tendency is to mention, to credit on the box the designer of the board games. Most of the time, they're also credited as not just a game designer, as in English, but as an author. So suddenly the board games, the way he's done, the way he presents himself, starting to present himself at cultural objects, just like a book, just like a movie. In a book, there's the author, there's the director, and suddenly from the 80s, we start to have board games that present itself as a cultural good. And you see that the credit of author is growing more and more. Also, what we see in the 80s is the transformation of the content, of the thematics, and there's a real editorial evolution. So when you look at the 60s and 70s, which is what's really funny, is that most of the production, at least on the French market, was really related to either highway, just playing with highway, with cars, or exploiting or mining, or about exploiting the oil. And from when you look at the theme at the 80s, it's make a turning point. So fantasy start to be one of the most predominant theme of the production, but also environment. So starting to have some games that doesn't present just how do you gonna mine or exploit oil the best way possible, but how to manage some resources. So suddenly the 80s make are a turning point in terms of thematics. So the 80s, suddenly there's a new generation. And for a long time, I will explain that a little bit in more detail later, but for a long time, the success of board games was really related to a generation, the one who grew in the 80s. And I'll tell you more about that later. But when you look, so in France, for example, there's more and more, and I think you have the case here, more and more production of board games. And now the last count we did is that you have more than 1,000 board games published on the French market. And so for a long time, the question was, what the hell? Who's going to buy all of that? And how is it possible to produce so much board games? And for a long time, this generation was the one who was buying the most. So it was kind of a targeted public, targeted audience who was buying more. And so this generation was really, who grew up in this year, were really the one who are buying and absorbing the production of board games. But it changed now. So clearly, these 80s are really interesting for that. Just it's a turning point for in terms of content. It's a turning point in terms of sociology of play practices, but it's also not that fun for the popular play practices. That's the moment, the 80s, when the working class and the industry is starting to collapse in France. And so, in a logical way, you see that there are less and less card games in the pub, card games in popular culture, and the leisure of popular class is going to move away from the play practices board games, not about video games, but for board games. So the new century is the moment where video games starting to be what we say hegemonic. So now the generation, so on the contrary of board games, there's no more generational effect about video games. When you look at the generation, the new generation, they're playing as much as the one before. And now we say hegemonic because when you're making a study with teenagers, for example, if one say, no, I didn't play video games, either he didn't understand the question or he just randomly answered the questionnaire. But now, yeah, it's over. So it's really encored into cultural practices, mainly in the young people, but it's starting to be encored into young adult and even what someone mentioned, the silver gaming. And you can see that the only thing which is changing now is the old people who are playing more and more video games. So this graph, I won't comment. I'm going to comment it quickly, but this line show you each new generation. So the last generation is this one, and it's a pink one. You can see it, but it's a pink one. And they're playing as much as the generation before. So a generation is 20, a cohort of people, from 20 or 60, 20, depends on the study. But you see that the only thing which is changing now is not about playing video games or not. It's about how long in your life and how many times in your life you're going to still playing video games. And it's increasing. So aging of the audience for video games is really what's happening now and what is really changing in the gamer culture. And the main difference too is that for a long time, video games was really stratified in terms of the kind of support you were playing on. So for a long time, console or computer were more really related to upper and middle class. Now it's over. Everybody's playing on everything. And the iPhone, the mobile phone just are now the first platform. So video game is now statistically losing its counter control and counter general effects, and things are just moving at the end of the life. In fact, when just all people are playing more and more. So what's changing now is maybe the virtualization of gaming practices, and that's something I'm working right now. Is that in France? So we know that now when you're taking randomly one video game practice in France, you have one chance now and two that it's going to be online. And so that happens at the beginning of the new century, but now it's really a fact. It's starting to, and that's maybe a COVID effect, it's starting to be more, this virtualization of gaming practice is starting to concern board games. So the last survey we did is that one board game session on 10 was made online. And and that's really happened just after the COVID period. So board games at the beginning of the new century doesn't stop to grow. So as I was mentioning, in 2020 there were on the French market more than 900 board games. So when you're measuring board games practices in France, you still have a kind of growing an expansion of people who are saying in survey that they are playing board games. But behind this expansion, we have to detail more who's saying and whom is playing. So the craze for board games in France really appeared at the beginning of the new millennium. So when you look now at the statistic, you have more than eight. You have around 80 people who said, "Yes, I've played board games this year." The half of the people it was occasionally, and 25% said, "Yeah, I'm playing at least one time a month." But behind this statistic, we have to distinguish three forms of practices, and the success of board games is really related not only to board gamers. I mean, we have board gamers around us, but the success of board games is not just about board gamers, and I will detail more about board gamers in France. But three forms of practices are making the market very powerful. So you have, family practices, occasional practices between adults, and fan practices. So when you look at the occasional practices between adults now, it's about 20% of the population, and who's got kids, of course, who are playing at least 1 month. So when you look at what they're playing, it's not definitely the mass market, not the what we call modern board games who are really successful. That's what we call belote. Maybe you don't know the belote, but it's a traditional French card game. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the adults. Tarot is also a very traditional card game. And so you have this percentage of the French people who are 20% who are playing from time to time, mostly to traditional games and few to modern board games. So the first one we have, just like a recent one, and there it's maybe Time's Up. That's the most recent board games. Family practice represent the same volume in terms of people playing. So you have around 25% of the family in France with young kids. I mean, kids under 18. Who play regularly board games with their kids. So it's mainly, so that's the difference. It's mainly modern board games or board games coming from the industry like Monopoly, Funny Bunny, of course, I don't know, Clue, Connect 4, all these games. And they are not quite the most recent game. What's really changed in the last decade is the social value of board games in a family. So when you look at the at old survey in France in the 60, 70, 80, when you were making more qualitative study, the family didn't value a lot board games. To tell it differently, playing board games for a long time in France with your kids, it's because it's raining and we don't know what to do. And so we're going to make a Clue or a Monopoly. And the recent studies we've made in the last decade show that the cultural value of board games in the family has changed. That means that it's not an activity by default, but that's something which is very supported by the parents and mainly by the mother. So now, when you're making survey, playing board games with the parents is not a default activity. It's a mark of good parenting. And when you dig more and more, you see that playing with your kids really, because of the video game industry and because of the screen now, and the social network, uh, parents are more pushing to play with their kids, because the time they spend with their kids playing board games, it's a time that is not wasted into watching TV or watching something on the internet. And that's quite new. And that's a big trend in the French population. Also, board games is still valued now for the a kind of learning and preparing, and as just like you can say, I'm going to read a book to my kid because I think it's a good book, I love the value. You see that you have the same discourse now in the close amongst the parents about board games. Now, let's talk about board gamers. So the French market is growing. The board game practices are increasing for decades now, and mainly because of the family practices among not the adult playing occasional players. Don't buy a lot of board games. But as I was mentioning before, board gamer in France are absorbing a big part of the market. It's really hard to define what's a board gamer, because people can say, "Oh no, I'm not a board gamer," but when you go to their place, they have, I don't know, 20, 30 different board games. So when you look at some indicators, just like involvement or engagement indicators, we can say that um, one French on 10 has really can be qualified as a board gamer. When you look at these people who are buying a lot of board games, you have, so that's main difference. So maybe most of the time it's young adult. It's really mixed. I mean that when you look at people who are passionate by board games, it's 50-50 between men and women. What characterizes them is that they're highly educated, with sometimes the predominant importance of science and management. And for a long time, there was a generational effect. So these people who grew in the 80s and still start to uh, uh, and still are buying board games. So what's the big difference is that we went to fun morality. I mean, a moment where board games in the 80s starting to be fun, to now a cultural morality. That means that when you're making study, people are defending not only the fun part of board games, and it's true for the board gamers, but it's also true for the family. But they defend now the cultural aspect of board games, and you can see that they are buying. So we've made a study about the importance of price of board games price, like Festival de Cannes. You know that, yeah. So we've made a study about what was the impact of this price, and now you can see that clearly. For a long time, it was just an indication. Now it's starting to be a very important label for the act of buying. We also see that board gamers now and people passionate about board games starting to have a very complex discourse about the cultural value, valuing some author, valuing some mechanics. And so that's really the big shift from the 60s or 70s, where board games was just seen as an entertainment. So my first question was, are we playing more than before? I could say yes, but no longer in the same social term. So this history of survey in France show that the importance of games in the daily lives of the population, and that's really now even the French Ministry of Culture now is integrating video games and board games into his policy. So For a part of the population, board games have become a legitimate cultural practice, really related, as they say that in the survey, with literature, cinema, or fiction. So the increase of board games for a long time was really related to a generational effect. And the good news is that the most recent data we have is that the new generation are starting to buy as much as board games that the generation before. So good news for the industry. So board gaming now appears to be very firmly established within the landscape of cultural practices in France. And so that's the main conclusion we can have, is that when you see that, you can tell for the industry that they have a good future. Thanks for your attention.
All right, everyone. Does anybody have any questions for Vincent? Hold on, I'll be right there. There you go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I wanted to ask, like, from a retailer perspective, is there any data that you have that can help us create some sort of like profiles for gamers so that we can better target these audiences when they come to the stores?
Yeah, I went very fast on one slide. In that, there was too many things to say. But when we call about cultural omnivorism, it's a notion in sociology. It's a kind of cluster. So you can cluster them by their cultural practices. So you know what I mean? So if you're trying to cluster the kind of board gamer people you can see related to their habits of going to the museum, for example, or stuff like that. So yeah, we can have some. And I know that Asmodee is really making more targeted. So maybe my difference with marketing approach is to see board game practices among the general population, and not just about people who are passionate about board games. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm not.
Yeah, I think I was thinking more so from, like, for example, let's take Mother's Day, right? Like, I'm trying to make a promotion for Mother's Day.
Yeah.
But I know that, games, when they're developing, they have their own personas in mind, right? But so how can I cluster them in a way that I can be like, hey, for the mom that is like this solo RPG or something like that. Like, I don't want it to be made clustering it based on a particular game category, but are there particular clusters of people that share some interests or some anything about their identities that can help me say, oh, this is the type of games that I should be recommending people with these profiles?
So I'm not sure I can answer that. What I'm quite sure is that when you look at the board games evolutions and mainly family practices, so family practices is mainly brought by the mother, and more she went by university, more she's gonna play with her kids. That's for sure. And you have a really strong correlation between the level of diploma of the mother and the use of board games. The other thing is that what's really strong in the survey is that family practices, it's mainly when the kids started to be 3 and 4 until 12. When the kids are 12, the board game practices in family disappear totally. There's really just few people still playing. And then board games come back with the university when they are 18 or 19. So I would say for the period of 12 to 18, yeah, it's not that interesting to work on that.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions from live Q&A. Actually, the first one that came up was, what was the reason in the 80s that kind of created the shift for more leisure time? Actually,
so for the French situation, at least the leisure time in general was increasing, definitely. So it's normal that in fact, when you look at the leisure, most of them progressed. So the other reason of this shift is that we changed the society changed totally. I mean, someone who's grew up in the 60s or 70s wakes up in the 80s. So the proportion of workers collapsed totally. So the France of the 70s was the working class were more than 30% of the population. Now they're around 10, something like that. So it's really because of the evolution of the industry, of the economy, that suddenly leisure activity board games starting to be a new kind of entertainment for middle and upper class. Yeah.
All right. There's a follow-up question to this that I think is really great as well too. The teenagers from the 80s that were playing games, with the study that was made, are they still playing games in the 2000s?
Oh yeah, for sure. They're a big part of the board gamer still now, and that's what maybe I wasn't that clear because of my English, but for a long time until 2010, most of the production in France of new board games was absorbed by this generation who grew up in the 80s. And now it's over. I mean, now there's a new generation, just people younger than the board gamers from the 80s who are buying board games. That's what I was seeing. That's a good news.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I have a couple more actually from Q&A, but just wondering if anybody else has other questions. Let's go with the other one here. It's very similar to the. Let's see. Are board gamer parents transferring their board game knowledge to new generations? It's something that we're seeing.
Yeah.
And as much as like buying and playing, is it something that from the study that kind of came out from that? Or
I'm not sure I can make the difference between. Main of my study are just about playing, not
playing,
really buying.
Okay.
So what changed is that. I told you that in the 70s, when we have some data, so playing board games with the kids was really low in the hierarchy of cultural activity. So it's reading and we have to do something. So it changed. But what also changed now is that for a long time, parents were valuing board games for educational aspect, just like, okay, let's play this game because he's going to learn to roll the dice, to count, to recognize the colors. So that's still present in the justification of playing with their kids. But what changed is the cultural aspect of board games. It's just like more about, oh, that's a moment of sociability. And that's quite a justification that is more present now when you're asking to the parents, why do you play board games with your kids? It's a time we spend together. It's a time out of the screen, and board games has intrinsic values, and just like a book or so, I want to show my kids good games. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any other questions, anybody? All right.
From a historical perspective, I'm curious if France had any analog to the satanic panic that impacted role-playing games in the 1980s.
Of course, we had. Yeah.
I didn't know if it went all the way across or if that was.
At the beginning of the role-playing game, there was a city called in France called Carpentras, and the cemetery has been broken. And all the media said it was role-playing game who did that. And of course, it was a role-playing game. And of course, it was the extra right. What a surprise! But that totally disappeared now. And board games. So what's interesting is that when you look at the values for a long time, now it's about video games. All the preoccupation of parents is about video games, but it's a little bit changed because of the COVID, and because during COVID, parents see that playing video games was also a way to have some sociability. So it's changing a little bit. But board games has good value now. You can say, let's play Dungeons and Dragons. So what a good idea. Right now, I'm working on, I didn't mention that, but right now I'm working about surveys about the COVID, what happened in the COVID. And we know that board game practices exploded during the lockdown. Yeah, that's a good word. The lockdown. And so we're wondering, did it last? I mean, did people, and what, now we know there's a kind of renewal of role-playing game in France, new generation starting to play role-playing games, like the ancient one. So it's also related to movie or series like Stranger Things, but also due to the confinement where the parents played role-playing games. So this generation played role-playing games and made them discover. And so we went to so before the COVID, the people in France, it was less than 2% of people who played role-playing game. And just after the COVID, and no, it was in 23, it's 5% of people who played role-playing game during the year, and it's mainly young people. So that's why I was saying that's a good news for the industry.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, I think that's a wrap. Vincent, thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you so much with us. It was amazing.